Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us in this Open University Business School webinar on inclusive leadership. My name is Martha Tenganesha, External Engagement Coordinator in the Faculty of Business and Law. I'm joined today by three guest speakers. The first is Simone Arthur, who is our Senior Manager, Equality, Diversity and Inclusion at the Open University. And we have Alvine Tremoulet, who is Pfizer Europe Inclusion Lead, Global Women's Council and Diversity and Inclusion Council Europe. And we have Tillmann Henssler, who is a Sourcing Manager at Pfizer and MBA alumni as well. The aim of this webinar is to examine and promote inclusive leadership, consider institutional and personal barriers to diversity and inclusion, and to share industry practices of diversity and inclusion. You'll be able to interact with us via the chat panel on your screen and submit any questions you have. You can also share comments throughout the session. We'll try and answer all your questions at the end during the Q&A session, but you'll also have an opportunity to reach out to our speakers for further questions after the webinar. Just so you know, the webinar is recorded and will be available online afterwards, so please feel free to share with colleagues and friends. To open the discussion, I would like to ask Alvine and Simone and Tillmann, I want to understand, what does diversity and inclusion mean to each of you? Alvine, perhaps maybe you can go first?
Yes, I'm going to go first, and thank you very much for having me and for inviting Pfizer through myself and Tillmann to share our experience and personal and, of course, professional experience on the topic. I think the first step to be inclusive, whether we're a leader, whether we're a colleague, whether we're any individual, is to really make sure we understand the meaning of these terms, the terms diversity and inclusion. Diversity is the summary of visible, and these, visible differences can be gender, age, disability, the skin of color, and also invisible difference. And invisible differences will be thinking and working styles, education, social background, and of course diversity of thoughts, personality, and experience and background. To summarize, cognitive diversity. Talking about the legal obligation, it's true that in the U.S. there are some legal obligations regarding ethnicity, race, for example, which is not the case in Europe. Legal obligation will appear most regarding topics like disability in countries like France and Germany, if I can take these examples. This is diversity. Moving to inclusion. Inclusion is really the culture and the fact of promoting the feeling of being valued. If you look or think different from the majority, for example, inclusion is an environment where you can express your opinions freely without being judged. A space where there is a psychological space to have a voice, where you feel you belong and where you are not an outsider. What I like to take as an example is a very famous D&I expert who says that diversity is being invited to the party, and inclusion is being invited to dance. So these are, a kind of description and definitions of diversity and inclusion. Martha?
Sorry about that. Thank you, Alvine. That was very insightful. Simone, perhaps maybe you would like to add your interpretation?
I think I'd just like to echo everything that Martha has just said. I think she's really put that neatly. But, I think really it's not only about understanding the terms, what is diversity. Yes, it's about the difference and the mix of different people. And then also what is inclusion. It's about embracing that diversity as Martha was talking about, but also how we translate that and demonstrate that as either individuals, and institutions, that is the key thing that we're trying to aim at here as well, and how we demonstrate that we do want to invite someone to the dance, as Martha says. And excited and looking forward to exploring that a little bit more, a little bit further on into the webinar.
Thank you, Simone. And that was Alvine as well, who nicely put it for us, who nicely interpreted the diversity and inclusion. Tillmann, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I think it's well summed up from Alvine and Simone. I think it's welcoming diversity and creating an environment where all different people can thrive and succeed. And I think what is important is that we all have to take action to include different people in the organization. It's people are different, and it's something we have to take action. Yeah, that's what I would like to add.
Thank you, Tillmann. I have to say that one of the things that's really struck me, Alvine, about what you said is about diversity being invited to the party and then inclusion being asked to dance. I absolutely love that particular phrase. So at the heart of diversity and inclusion is inclusive leadership. And most of us are somewhat familiar with the term inclusive leadership and understand it as a management practice that promotes integration at all levels and an inclusive culture. Tillmann, what does inclusive leadership capture in your view?
Yes, thank you, Martha. To myself, I've been very passionate about raising awareness and helping to reduce unconscious bias towards people with disabilities. So I've held the honorary office of Disability Council. It's a function in Germany called Schwerbehindertenvertretung. It has a legal function also for the last 16 years, which includes, for example, supporting the workplace management integration program we have, which helps colleagues to return to work after long-term illness or an accident. I think one of the key things with disability is actually people are not very, people's attitudes towards disability is very inconsistent. Some people feel sorry for people with disabilities and others admire them for their courage. And often I think colleagues and managers don't see the abilities that actually disabled people bring to work, it's a real challenge and greatness to actually help people that it can happen to anyone at any time. Basically, I think a lot of the cases that are of disabled people that are helped, they all of a sudden in that situation. And it's very difficult for people to come out and cope with the situation and adjust, basically. I think, and the main thing when coming to helping people with disabilities is that it's not the disability itself that's maybe the main barrier, but it's actually the way the workplace is designed in many cases. There are many things you need to consider to accommodate the workplace, and this is the point. I think everyone, especially disabled people, they can use all the talent and skills if they have the right technical tools and equipment to work at their workplace. And important part also is to the environment of the disabled person to raise awareness for the different kinds of disabilities that there are. Sometimes a physical disability has a different impact than someone who's blind or has a hearing impairment. So this is where you need to help people and raise the awareness with the colleagues, so they feel that they belong and have the team support that they need. The other thing is that you need to encourage people to help disabled people. In practice, I think it's for some people to identify and challenge the biases about disabled persons and the negative reactions that they might have. Also, convincing people and helping people to show them that that the team members can progress, that disabled people have a chance to use their skills, and actually actively see if it can adjust the workplace to help them increase their performance. I think this is that's what I see in taking leadership.
Great, thank you so much, Tillmann. Alvine, I'll pose the same question to you. What does inclusive leadership capture in your view?
I think inclusive leadership for me is making sure that, as I said, every voice is heard, because at the end of the day, it's a performance that we are targeting. I have a good, and I don't know if some of our listeners had a chance to watch the film Hidden Figures. The movie is about these at the time of the racial segregation in the U.S. in the 60s at the NASA. So an inclusive leader, interpreted by Kevin Costner, really made sure that no matter of the social issues at that time, he really made sure that he's involving those who have the skills to really send that man to the moon, and they managed to do it and send the man in the orbit, and he made that up. He made that happen because he removed barriers. And for me, an inclusive leader is someone who removes barriers, to meet, the final objective for the colleagues, for the company, and of course with an external, recognition of these actions. So for me, an inclusive leader is someone who removes barriers for people.
Thank you, Alvine. Simone, do you have anything to add to that?
Not really. I do again agree with what Alvine and Tillmann just said about that. I mean, one of the things I often think of when I think of a leader who's inclusive, I think of it could be a person or an institution when I say leader, but someone or an institution that is acutely aware of potential biases or preferences. It could be their own or institutional. But prioritizes aiming to consider the different views and perspectives to sort of inform relevant decision making throughout the organization. So it's about an institution, so acknowledging that we will have biases, and that individuals, staff or customers that they deal with will have biases and preferences, but then again recognizing that they would need to have processes in place to avoid and to address these barriers or potential barriers. So for example, in the case of the Open University, we are very big on all projects conducting equality impact assessments. We're also trying to make sure we have the right policies and systems in place. Bullying and harassment policies, for example. So it's about that institution or leader or senior manager recognizing that we each are prone to being biased, but as long as we have some transparent processes in place and policies in place, that we should be able to promote equality and inclusion.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Simone. Tillmann, you did mention already a number of barriers that people with disabilities encounter, and of course there are multitudes of barriers to diversity and inclusion, and institutional and individual barriers that manifest differently in different organizations. So I'd be I know you've already touched on this, Simone, but it'll be interesting to hear what you perceive to be the most common barriers in realising diversity and inclusion. Simone, perhaps you can go.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, Marta. So, this is from, as Alvine said in the beginning, this is going to be our individual perspective, based on what we've witnessed at our own organization, and in my case, not only my organization, but across the sector. So this is not only necessarily unique to the Open University, which operates in the United Kingdom, but also common issues across the higher education sector, and hopefully it will be relevant to other types of organizations as well. So in terms of barriers, I sort of tried to break these down into individual barriers and institutional barriers, sort of separate them out. In terms of individual barriers, which, of course, would also be linked to the institutional barriers in a sense, there's a sort of a lack of an awareness across staff groups, especially not only lack of awareness among staff in general who might not fall into protected groups, but also among staff who fall into protected groups. So, for example, you would have women not understanding the potential systemic biases that might be in their way for progression, or as Tillmann mentioned earlier about disabled staff, they might also not know they might not even be aware that they fall into a category of disability. Sometimes people suffering from, for example, diabetes or hypertension might, those sort of invisible disabilities might not consider themselves as disabled and therefore not understand that the organization has a right to support them. So I find that this is often a barrier to inclusive practices. If staff aren't aware, then of course they might not participate in activities that might be there to gather data or to collect information or perception from them that would then inform policies and changes across the organization. Then I sort of tried to, for every barrier I identified, I tried to look at some way of how we counter that. And in our experience here at the Open University, in terms of that lack of awareness, it's obvious, we tried to counter that by, raising awareness, having lots of awareness raising activities, such as, they could be in the form of training, more active informal staff network groups. And we have staff network groups here by characteristics. So we have one for disability, BME staff, and these are usually informally and self-organized groups. But, once you have these organized groups, they represent one voice and it's organized, and it's a stronger voice within the organizational system. And those kinds of measures help to accelerate changes in attitudes and policies and senior management attitude as well. Then there's also a lack of institutional commitment. So I think just to sort of unpack that a little bit, I shouldn't be saying lack of institutional commitment, but sort of to say that the heart is always in the right place, but you'd often find across the sector here in the UK that budgets for work around equality and diversity and inclusion quite small, or much smaller than the budgets for other activities. And this has lots of knock-on effects, So funding is a major barrier. And again, how we've countered that, and we're still trying to counter that across the university, we've been using data. So, collecting, data, quantitative data and qualitative data. So quantitative data on, for example, career progression and promotion for women, looking, at is there a disproportionate number of men in senior positions when compared to their female counterparts? Qualitative data like, capturing staff perceptions on, for example, promotional processes, staff development, availability of support mechanisms, and what we've been finding here at the OU is that data, presents a sort of an evidence-based approach to any kind of change we want to bring about at the university, be it change in attitudes of senior management or staff in general, and it really does help gain buy-in across the institution. And I think the last barrier that I'd like to highlight, and we have a multitude of barriers, but these are the top three that I've worked with. So policies and procedures. Again, at the Open University here, we have lots of policies and procedures for almost everything you could think of, but they're really tucked away and sometimes can be very complex documents. Often also not reaching the people that they're targeted at, but we have them. We have them somewhere lying about on our intranet. But what we've been finding is that we need to be doing a bit more work, and we have started quite a lot of work in terms of devising more robust implementation plans for policies, and monitoring the actual implementation of these policies. Are they reaching the right staff? Are people finding them helpful? Are people finding them more confusing? Not just for affected staff, but are line managers also aware of these policies? So, sort of monitoring the impact as well. And of course, apart from that, there's always the training element of it, training, making sure that people, line managers are trained enough on these policies and the implementation of them as well. So in a nutshell, those are the top three for me that I see as barriers. But hopefully you found some of that useful in terms of countering these potential barriers. Over to you, Martha.
Thank you, Simone. Yes, that was very comprehensive and that's very holistic in terms of how it affects looking at both an individual but as well as an institution and challenges. So it'll be very interesting to hear what Alvine, you have experienced at Pfizer.
Well, of course, I'm going to talk about that in the this is in the plan, but challenges, she mentioned that Simone already unconscious bias, of course, because we are all different. We are coming from different culture. We have a different, education. We can even be from the same country, from the same, culture, but we are coming from different families. We have different values, and we are the result of what we learn from experience, from family dinners, from family, lunches. Unconsciously, these are things that are in our minds, and when we have to take, strategic decision, and here we are talking about the workplace, when we have to take strategic decision, when we have to recruit, when we have to engage with colleagues, unconsciously we are going to do things, to say things that can be definitely barriers to be an inclusive leader. And the very first step for us is to know ourselves. Who are we? What can have a bad impact in a strategic decision? So I think, these are barriers. And of course, other barriers to take into account is that sometimes, and me the first, we are so much in silos, so much doing a task, and even avoiding look around us. And sometimes it's not, we are not consciously, the exclusion is not intentional. Sometimes we can exclude non-intentionally. So these are the kind of barriers, of course. I can mention again to what Simone talked about is the lack of awareness. We don't know what we don't know. So it's really bringing educate people. And I want to take the example of, the sexual orientation, a question that I'm taking the example of France. When we raised the topic internally, some colleagues didn't understand, which I understand clearly, because for them, sexuality is not something we should talk about in the workplace. But what they don't know is that someone who is sexually different, who has another sexual orientation, sometimes they have to hide themselves by, with the fear of being judged. Sometimes they're going to lie to other colleagues. When you're a heterosexual, for example, you will come to the office, share your family life, share what you did during the weekends with your husband, with your children, which is not, in many cases, the case of, someone who is sexually different. He will hide himself or herself. And if you hide yourself, you're not your true self. And if you're not your true self, you're not able to really deliver, 100% because you're not yourself. So these are the kind of barriers. There are, of course, many, many others, but I wanted to take that particular example on, related to sexual orientation.
Thank you, Alvine. Tillmann, do you have anything to add?
Yes, Alvine and Simone already echoed a lot of the points which are so true. I think maybe just for the disability part, that's what I find in many cases. It's for the disabled person to have the courage to talk about the disability in the team and to get the help that they can. I mean, in Germany, for example, and in other markets, there's external organizations, institutions that can kind of deliver the expertise, how to adjust the workplace. And what I find is that when people open up and talk about a disability, actually afterwards it's like a relief for them, and it kind of improves their performance and the feeling of worthiness within the team. So that's a kind of a key barrier, of course. And one thing I've also noticed is that when people are in teams, that people are aware of the disability of the person, but they tend to forget. If someone has a hearing impairment, they remember most of the time, but there's always situations then they forget about that their colleague has a hearing impairment, and it's this inclusiveness that it has to has to be ongoing and just being reminded, so that people are feeling valued in the company. Yes, that's what I would like to say.
Thank you, Tillmann. So you've all highlighted a number of barriers which are highly relevant, and Simone, you've already touched on frameworks that could be implemented to overcome these. So we'll just move on to the section about looking at the frameworks and tools that we as individuals and perhaps as organization can implement to promote a culture of inclusion. Perhaps, Alvine, you want to go first?
Yes, I can share the example of Pfizer, the way it is structured, because it should first of all be led by senior leaders, because they are the ones who really set the tone. At Pfizer, we have an executive governance, and today the CEO at the global level is the sponsor of that executive committee, and then of course we have in the executive committee. I'm talking about the global point of view, and then I will come down to Europe. At the global level, we have that executive committee with a number of Pfizer council colleagues. So we have a council on disability, we have a council on sexual orientation called Open, we have a council on gender, we have a council on veterans, a council on Latinos, council with Asians, council with Global Black Council. I think I mentioned all of them. And then, of course, each council is really setting the priority of what they are going to do during the years, and each council has an executive sponsor, and that executive sponsor really sits on the executive leadership team in New York. Moving to Europe, we have a council, and the way it is structured is that we have two sponsors who are again executive leaders in Europe. We have chairs, we have, and then we have members, and the council is quite diverse with men, colleagues coming from different functions, different countries in Europe. Different ethnicity as well, and of course different sexual orientation. We are really making sure that the council reflects the whole organization in Europe. And in addition to these council members, we have work streams who will, focus on gender, on disability, on sexual orientation, Open Europe, on cross-generation, on inclusive culture. We mentioned, so we're talking about inclusive leadership, and of course, how do we make sure to really embed this inclusive culture in Europe? And this is at the European level. And then each country will have a diversity and inclusion group, again, at the country level. Most of the time, the country lead is the sponsor with members of that D&I group at the country level. They are going to, set their own priorities, of course, making sure that these priorities are aligned with the regional priority, European priority, and with the global priority related to D&I. They are going to look at many topics, gender, disability, as I mentioned, cross-generation. Of course, it's also linked to each country's own social context and anything they want to really prioritize. So we are not really obligating them to choose one topic. It's really related to what they think is most urgent in their country. What we are really making sure at the European level is only making sure that it's aligned with our priorities and with the global ones. So related to these tools and framework, of course, we have communication, internal communication to continue raise awareness, educate colleagues. We have internal social media. We are using Yammer internally to really promote these topics, educate them, and when there are challenges, make sure that we are discussing with them and see how we can, go through these challenges. Of course, unconscious bias, because you're showing this as a framework, and the inclusive culture program, and I'm going to talk about that later again, is among, tools that we put in place to really make sure that colleagues, leaders understand what it is. Unconscious bias, making sure that they are aware, or at least they start, making an assessment of who they are as individuals, as leaders, as colleagues, and then we developed tools so that they can be able to have these difficult conversations, because most of the time the topic of D&I is not comfortable for many people, but it's really about starting to be uncomfortable to really be comfortable and make sure that there are results around the topic. I'm going to cover that again later in the inclusive culture program at Pfizer Europe, because this is an example I really want to share, experience I want to share. Yes, colleague results group are really key. They are the change agents, and we're making sure to empower them with tools, educating them, making sure that leaders in countries are really, informed of what to do to help them with the budget, any resources they might need. You are talking about charters here. Yeah, of course, it's good to sign charters, diversity and inclusion charters, but it's really making sure that it's not only about signing charters, but really walking the talk. So this is where we are, I have to say, at Pfizer Europe, with the council, with CRGs locally, and of course, another topic, we also have allies. We will have, I don't know if those who are listening are familiar with the allyship. We'll have allies with the open group, the sexual orientations, which is making a huge difference in really engaging colleagues on these topics. So our colleague resource group, our allies, our leaders, of course, are really making sure that the topic of diversity and inclusion is well understood, not only well understood, but how it is translated on a day-to-day basis when we recruit, when we engage with colleagues, and of course the impact that it will have for our patients, because as you know, Pfizer is a pharmaceutical company. Everything we are doing internally is to make sure that we take care of our people, so that these people are going to take care of our patients. Thank you.
Thank you, Alvine. And definitely the tools and frameworks you highlighted are all applicable in different industries and within different companies. Perhaps, Simone, you'd like to add anything, perhaps maybe from a higher education perspective?
Sorry, I was chatting away on mute. Well, so I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slide. But we, across the higher education sector, we do place a lot of confidence on in charters and benchmarking programs. I'll give you a bit of a flavor for our experience with a couple of those charter marks from the Open University perspective. But I know Alvine alluded to not just about signing charters, or not probably, I guess, not taking a sort of a tick box approach to these charters. So which is also a concern. But as you will see when I give a little bit of a summary as to our experience, that yes, it could be seen outside as that, but our experience here at the university and across the sector, you would find that a lot of institutions would testify to the usefulness of participating in these charter marks. And like I said, I'll touch on that in the next slide.
Perfect. So in the interest of time, I will just move on to looking at our individual experiences. So perhaps, Simone, you can continue to talk about your particular experience of implementing some of these frameworks at the OU.
Okay. Well, like I just said 2 seconds ago, we have been participating in quite a lot of charter marks across the sector. So we have participated in Stonewall, which is the Stonewall Workplace Equality Index, and that's a charter mark that is looking at best practice for sexual orientation, so for staff and customers who fall into that category of, LGBT, lesbian, bisexual, gays, and trans plus. We've participated in the carers charter. We've gained carer status and again, that's just for carers. We have participated in Athena's one. That's quite a big charter over here for gender in the UK. We have bronze status, and some departments within the institution have silver status for Athena's one. And we have also participated in the disability standard, and we have bronze status there as well. And we're just about to start, we've started already the application process for the Race Equality Charter. And this section, what I wanted to talk about here is talk about why I see charter marks as valuable, and just to give a bit on the experience, sort of a race equality charter versus disability standard, to show you how they can be different, the experiences can be different. So for those of you who might not be really familiar with equality charters and benchmarks, these are programs that enable, organizations like ourselves to apply for an award to sort of recognize that organization's commitment to and progress on equality and diversity. And they're often, they are independent and external to your organization, which again is a good thing for me. And the way it works, it's a sort of an evidence-based approach. So, you have an application form, and there's various pieces of evidence that you must submit in terms of data, examples of good practice, and quite a lot of evidence that you have to submit around things that they would ask for. The most crucial element of the application process and of the application itself is the action plan. So you're expected, once you've suggested your data, submitted your data, examples of good practice or bad practice, and you've sort of interrogated that data and analyzed it, you then have to come up with a very ambitious and smart action plan based on that data that you'll be committing to for the next set of years. And in most cases, your application is valid for 3 years. So you're given a sort of a 3-year period within which to implement a particular action plan. And this whole evidence gathering process, of course, involves staff participation. So you're gathering not only quantitative data that you might get from your human resources department and your particular faculty or school, but also across the organization. You want to be speaking to staff, you want to be understanding their concerns, and you're going to want them to help inform that action plan. So in a sense, this is sort of a public demonstration of the institution's commitment, and I think it's a really good, the action plan is something that staff can even hold the institution as accountable for and be able to see where the priorities are for a particular organization. So it's good in that sense. And in terms of our experience here at the Open University, I've singled out a disability standard and the race equality charter, which we're sort of 75% through the application process, and the disability standard, which we gained bronze for about 2 years ago. So why I have it as that is to show that I think that some characteristics, some protected characteristics, so, you know, in this case, race and gender, appear to be a bit more weighty than others. And, you know, for example, in this case, I think that disability, for multiple reasons, has been prioritized differently across the organization than has been race. So, you know, some of the things that I think account for that would be the whole conversation around disability. It's more prominent than race, you know, and also we have, in our case, we have about 20% of our student body, they are disabled and they fall into that category. So it came as no surprise to us that gaining buy-in from all categories of staff when we were conducting the disability standard assessments, it was a much easier task than for what we're going through for the race equality charter. You know, and I think, of course, you know that the whole race and ethnicity debate is probably not as far along as what it is for disability. And we have been encountering quite a lot of barriers for this action plan. Like I said, you know, for all these Chartermarks, you rely heavily on staff and student. In our case, our customers are students. You rely on their participation, their engagement, because you get the data from them, you get perception, feedback from them. So all of this has an impact on how thorough you could do your Chartermark application. So we've had quite a lot of awareness raising activities, more so for the Race Equality Charter than we had to for the Disability Standard. So gaining, you know, starting a conversation around race and ethnicity was something we didn't have to do in the case of the disability. So it's a more difficult process for the race and ethnicity application. And, you know, so in terms of gaining senior management buy-in and all of that, that has been impacted because of the lack of visibility of this particular characteristic. So in terms of life after accreditation, our experience with the disability standard, you know, we have now a series of better policies in place for staff. We now have better implementation plans for those policies. We have better systems in place, example, around reasonable adjustments. People now are more informed about their rights and expectations and what they should expect from the university. And we also have more refined ways of monitoring data, which would, of course, continue to lead to actions that we might need to implement because of what we might find in data. In terms of race, as I said, we are going to be applying for that in July, and we're quite far ahead now. But we can also start seeing greater awareness of issues around ethnicity, and we've been able to connect the dots and show the relevance of ethnicity and ethnicity data and evidence to various staffing groups, for example, our tutors and line managers. And yeah, a very different experience, but I think, having the independent view of a charter organization and having the institution having to commit to an ambitious action plan and demonstrate that commitment in implementing that plan is a very good way of ensuring that we do have equality of opportunity in the organization.
Great, thank you. Alvine, I know you've already mentioned a number of programs and frameworks that Pfizer has. Would you like to add to that briefly?
Yeah, there's one, of course, because we're talking about inclusive leadership. I really want to talk about the inclusive culture program at a European level that we put in place. Of course, we work with an external agency specialized in business psychology. However, we really made sure that these consultants are coming to train our people so that the expertise can remain internally, and so that our own colleagues are able to continue having these conversations internally with colleagues. So the objective was really to, across Pfizer Europe, to create better connections between colleagues from diverse backgrounds, so that we have a positive impact on our working environment, and providing tangible and practical tools, and clearly embedding the inclusive culture in our workplace. We really moved from managing unconscious bias, because colleagues have gone through unconscious bias training, to understanding inclusive behaviors at the European level. So we had tools like practice and improve, just-in-time exercise, things that colleagues can do at their desk, and of course live events where we are having workshops addressing the different cases of being non-inclusive, whether you're a colleague or whether you're a leader. When you recruit, for example, when you have a performance discussion with colleagues, for example, when you have a preferred colleague, for example, that you're not aware of. These are the kind of things we took into account. Leader debates, and now we are really moving to how do we measure what we are doing, because it's good to know that we are having these discussions, that we are doing all that we are doing at Pfizer, but where we are really moving forward now is how do we measure what we are going to do. Of course, we have our annual, internal, survey with an inclusion index, but it's really see how we can do that on a much more regular basis, instead of only one time a year. So that's what I wanted to share, very briefly regarding Pfizer experience, the Inclusive Culture Program in Europe.
Great, thank you, Alvine. Tillmann, did you have anything to add before we move on to the Q&A? Tillmann, are you with us?
I was on mute, sorry, yes. I think I'd like to share the one with the colleague resource group. I think the other topics on the slide are very disability focused, because that was my influence, obviously. But colleague resource group is a very good tool, because there's many people in organizations who would like to get involved, get engaged, and they're passionate about different topics. So it's a way for people to with a common interest to come together and and help the community For disability, for example, we have a lot of caregivers, who don't have a disability themselves, but in their family, in their friends, or in the surroundings, they know people who have a disability and who want to help them. So it's a good opportunity for them to network and share experiences and best practices, and to discuss the topics. Recently, we had an event called the International Disability Day on December 3rd. So throughout the Pfizer sites in Europe and globally, we had stands or stalls where colleagues were, promoting the topic of disability, raising awareness for different kinds of visible and invisible disabilities, and how you could actually help your colleagues. So I think that's a good framework for people at a local level and whatever company size they're working in to form a group and just get involved. That's all I would like to say to that.
Great, thank you so much, and thank you all for your contributions. We're now moving on to the Q&A section. We don't have a lot of time, unfortunately, so I'll probably ask the 2 questions out of the many questions we have received. But just be rest assured to all of you who have asked questions that I will be posing these questions to the speakers, and they will provide some answers for you after the webinar. So the first question we have is, you sometimes hear of large companies, including Pfizer from personal experience, for senior positions of candidates having to fit with the corporate culture. If you really have a meaningful, inclusive and diversity process, shouldn't companies adapt themselves more to fit in with individual cultures rather than the other way around?
Yeah. So thank you very much. Just to make sure that I understand your question. So the question is about candidate applying for jobs and without answers, or candidate applying for jobs and Pfizer asking them to fit in. Is it the question? Just to make sure that before answering.
I guess I would understand it as candidates having to fit into a specific.
Marta, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. My apologies.
Yeah. So candidate
Yes, my understanding is more from candidates having to fit into a corporate culture, opposed to companies adapting their cultures to reflect the diversity or specific needs of individuals.
Yes, of course. This is. I'm not maybe going to talk about Pfizer regarding the corporate. What I will say is that of course every company has a culture, and I think that our culture is the ONID culture, where everyone, where we are able to discuss when things matter, and really internally when we are not okay with something, we are able to open the door of our manager and have a difficult but honest conversation, and we are calling that a straight talk conversation. And I think, of course, within a company there are many individuals, and it's hard really to know who are really respecting our culture and who is not respecting our culture. And in this case, I think to fit to our culture, for me, is to fit out with our ONID culture, an ONID culture which is a culture of ownership, accountability, straight talk. This is our culture. So I think if you don't want to fit to that kind of culture, then there's maybe challenging for someone coming from outside. For me, I think that it's a good culture, a culture that enables me to speak out, a culture that enables me to have a straight talk, a culture that enables me to be accountable on my acts. And it's a culture that is, for me, aligned with our diversity and inclusion culture. So when someone is making a challenging question around fitting in, I think to fit to that culture, for me, I don't see an issue. I hope it answers to that question, but And of course, it's a culture where, talking about diversity and inclusion, where every voice, we are really making sure that every voice is heard. I'm not saying that all colleagues, that all leaders are really, following this culture, but these are our values, these are the rules of the company.
Great, thank you, Alvine. The next question I'll ask is one from Ruth Nicholson, and she asked, I wouldn't consider myself to be exclusive, but what are the common mistakes that I might be making or biases I might not be aware of? Simone, maybe perhaps you'd be interested in answering this question?
Ruth, I think only Ruth might be able to answer that question, but I think the starting point I would advise would be to look at the characteristics that you yourself possess and see where you think you line up in terms of so I don't know if you might fall into the category of disabled staff. You might be identifying as a female. You might be BME, and I think that in itself, understanding your characteristics and the dynamics of that in the bigger space in which you operate would determine what could be your potential biases. What are you used to? What's your background? What do you see as the norm? What do you see as how things should be? You might have a particular religious persuasion. Are you tolerant? So I think it's about that introspection that is really a useful process. There are quite a few tools out there. There's the Harvard implicit bias test. There are quite a lot of tools and training around unconscious bias that would help you reflect on that and sort of identify what you could be biased against. And then I think once you're conscious of your potential biases, then it's about finding ways to avoid your biases taking over your decision-making processes. And yeah, I think that's what I would say.
Great. And we have another question from Stefan, who says, sometimes companies are not as enthusiastic. So how would the specialist address this form of adaptive leadership perspective? Let me ask that question again. Sometimes companies are not as enthusiastic. So how would the specialist address this from an adaptive leadership perspective?
This is a very good question. I think it's important for leaders. Even specialists should have an educative, how can I say that, mindset. We are educating people and really having a dialogue with these leaders to let them understand that it is good for them, it is good for the business at the end of the day. They are going to have a better performance if they're inclusive. It's just showing figures when possible, making a benchmark with a team, non-inclusive team, the result of a non-inclusive team and the result of an inclusive team. So showing figures to them sometimes makes a difference. And today we are no more able to avoid these topics because they are really related to our societal challenges as well. We see what's happening in the world today, and what's happening in the world affects us. The companies should be, and that's me, an argument that I'm using. We should also be a mirror of our society. So we have a role to play in what's happening in the world today. So among other arguments you can give, these are some I would give personally.
Thank you very much, Alvine. And thank you all for joining us. We have now come to the end of the webinar. I do hope you have found it insightful as well as useful. Please remember to check our website for any future events and webinars. And thank you again to our guest speakers. And I shall bid you all to have a good afternoon.
Thank you.